Alrighty. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending. Thank you to Jim and Bill and CAHS for inviting me to present. I think this is my 5th time presenting. It's always fun. So I have to admit that when Bill suggested that I present on this particular topic, I was a little apprehensive. I said, okay, I'm really passionate about this topic. I can deliver a pretty good presentation about it, but it has nothing to do with aircraft. And Bill says, well, of course it does. Fallout shelters protect you from stuff dropped by aircraft. So I'm like, okay, fair enough. And actually reminds me when I was studying aerospace engineering in university, we had a saying which was, aerospace engineers build weapons, civil engineers build targets. So tonight I'm going to be presenting to you on a rather forgotten aspect of Canadian Cold War history, which is NDFRS, the Nuclear Detonation and Fallout Reporting System. And this was a massive undertaking. This would have involved the construction of 2,000 small fallout reporting posts from coast to coast. Unfortunately, it never came online. They finished about half of it before they ran out of money and decided that it wasn't worth it and promptly canceled the project in 1963. And all the infrastructure was just abandoned. Yet despite how big this project was, how much money and how many resources they poured into it, it's almost forgotten today. Almost nobody has written anything about it. And when I found out about it and started really digging into the history, I decided, well, I'm going to change that. And so over the last summer, I've been driving up and down the province trying to find the remains of this system. And my eventual goal is to find all of it, all across Canada, and write the definitive book on that portion of Canada's Cold War history. So I'm going to be presenting briefly on the history of NDFRS. What was it? What would have been used for? What happened to it? And then I'll give a bit of an update on the research I've done so far. So let's begin at the beginning and how I actually got interested in this topic. So a couple of years ago, I was at Victoria Beach. My in-laws own a cottage up there. And we're coming back from the beach to the cottage, and my brother-in-law says, hey, look over at that cottage. And I look, and I see these things sticking up out of the ground. There's actually 2 of them. The other one's a little bit farther back there. So this pipe with what looks like a coffee can on top of it. And he says, well, that's the remains of a Cold War fallout shelter that used to sit under the post office. Post office is gone. It was just a shack with a couple of pigeonholes in it, but there's a cottage there now. And he added, when I was a teenager, my friends and I would go down into that fallout shelter so we could drink beer underage, as one does. And that absolutely fascinated me. It really caught my attention, but unfortunately the owners weren't home. I wasn't able to explore it. Other things got in the way, and I never got around to really investigating it at the time. Fast forward about 10 years, and I have my YouTube channel, our own devices. I thought, oh, hey, that fallout shelter is something really cool to cover. It's a really neat remnant of the Cold War. And at the same time, as I was able to get access to the shelter by actually contacting the owners, Mr. Gord Crossley, who we all know, put me onto an article that explained what exactly this shelter was. And it wasn't, as I had originally assumed, just the construction of some paranoid postal employee or a cottager. It was actually part of a much larger system, which was NDFRS. And to understand what that system was used for, we have to understand the major strategic changes that were taking place in the Cold War in the early 1960s. So early in the Cold War, so late 40s, early 50s, civil defense measures were pretty much identical from what they had been during the Second World War. They thought that the effects of a nuclear blast would be very similar to a conventional raid using high explosives or incendiaries. It would destroy a part of the city, set the rest of it on fire, and you could still send in firefighters and air raid wardens and police officers and trained citizens and anybody into the rubble to rescue people. And a lot of the civil defense training focused on those sorts of skills, how to get somebody down from a multi-story building, how to pick through rubble and shift rubble safely, how to administer first aid. And also people were encouraged to build fallout shelters in their basements, and the government had no shortage of pamphlets illustrating how you could build one out of cinder blocks and lumber and things you could find at the hardware store. Unfortunately, the lowest cost for one of these was around $500, which was a chunk of change back in the late 50s and early 60s. So not a lot of people could actually afford to do that. But still, the philosophy at the time was shelter in place, rescue people from the city. But then something happened that made that untenable. That was the development of thermonuclear weapons. So a kiloton range conventional nuclear weapon, like the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, will destroy part of a city. So, for example, if you dropped one of those bombs, a 100 kiloton bomb on Central Park in New York, you'd destroy part of Manhattan. A 1 megaton or a 10 megaton thermonuclear weapon, however, would destroy most of the surrounding boroughs. And this is just the blast radius. This is not counting fire damage and radiation and things like that. So really, there was no point in doing anything inside the city. Everybody was dead. So what they switched to was a policy of evacuation. As soon as you had warning of an attack, you evacuated everybody out into the countryside. And of course, in Canada, we had the Dew Line, the Pine Tree Line, the Mid-Canada Line, and we were quite far from Russia, meaning we had quite a bit of warning of a nuclear attack, at least when manned bombers were the only way of deploying these weapons. And so even though you had cities the size of Toronto and Montreal, the plans, according to the calculations, said that you can actually evacuate them in time. That warning, of course, shrank significantly with the introduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles down to around 30 minutes. But still, they still had plans to evacuate most of the city. But there was still a problem, which was if you evacuated people from the city, yes, they were saved from being instantly obliterated, but then you had the fallout, which is all the radioactive dust and water and other material that gets sucked up into the fireball and rains back down to Earth, contaminating everything. What's the point of evacuating into the countryside if you're just going to die of radiation poisoning? Unfortunately, the government at the time claimed that they did not have the resources or the wherewithal to provide communal shelters for everybody like they were doing in countries like Sweden, where it was actually mandatory for new buildings to include a fallout shelter. They were more than happy, however, to protect themselves. So you probably all know about the Diefenbunkers. The most famous one is just in Carp, 30 kilometers north of Ottawa, but there are actually 7 of them all across the country, and we had one here in Manitoba at Shiloh. It's all sealed up now. They use the hill for PT. They run up and down the hill, but you can't get into it anymore. And yeah, so all across Canada. And when the Canadian public found out about these, they were mighty pissed. And I remember reading a letter from a lady from Vancouver, wrote to Prime Minister Diefenbaker and said, well, it was something to the effect of, I hope that when you finally emerge from your bunker, you won't trip over our corpses. So yeah, people were not happy about this. And so the government realized they had to do something. They had to find some way of protecting people that was short of building giant fallout shelters for everyone. So they wanted to build a monitoring system, something that could track fallout across the countryside and tell people where to go. This place is contaminated, this place is safe, go there. And so they started looking around to see how they could build one of these. So the first place they looked was the United States, which had built the Radiation Alert Network. This still exists. This is known as RADNet. It's operated by the EPA. And this was a system of automatic sensors on the roofs of federal buildings all across the country. And here, the green dots are the ones that are still in operation today. All the red dots are defunct sites. This worked pretty well, but the Canadian government, in classic fashion, said this is too complicated, this is too technologically advanced, this is too expensive, we can't do this. So they looked instead to the UK. So the Royal Observer Corps had a system of small man shelters all across the British Isles. And so these were little shelters. They could carry around 4 or 5 people for a couple of weeks. And they were equipped with equipment not only to monitor fallout, but also to determine the yield and the location of a nuclear weapon, the nuclear detonations themselves. So there's actually a really fun little video called A Hole in the Ground that's on YouTube, and it shows how one of these stations actually would have operated. So Canada looked at that and said, that's a lot easier, we're going to do that. And they created NDFRS, the Nuclear Detonation and Fallout Reporting System. And so this was a system of man shelters like in the UK that would have stretched from coast to coast through all 10 provinces. And the plan was to build around 2,000 of them. And they would have been arranged in a rough grid pattern to make the reporting a little more accurate. It wasn't an exact grid, though, because as we'll see later on, the government insisted on building these on federal land. And so you had to find the nearest town that had a federal building, post office, RCMP detachment, things like that. And they used to have, at the beginning, plans to actually build them all the way up into the territories, but after a while they realized, A, not a lot of people live up there, B, it was too expensive. So as an austerity measure, they got rid of all of them above the 52nd parallel, I believe it was. So they were mostly down here. Now, the system consisted of 3 different types of stations. So the most numerous, I'm going to use Manitoba here as an example because otherwise the map of Canada would just be full. The first were the fallout reporting posts. So these were usually two-man little fallout shelters that were equipped with radiation monitoring equipment. These were meant to track fallout as it drifted across the countryside. There was also another type of monitoring post known as a nuclear detonation or a NUDET post. These were equipped with equipment to track the location and the intensity of the nuclear flash. In Manitoba, there were three of these. There was one at the Great Falls Generating Station, there was one at RCAF Gimli, and one at RCAF Portage la Prairie. And then finally, there were filter centers. So these were data processing centers, and so the reports that would have been phoned in by the fallout reporting posts and the NUDET posts would have been sent to the filter centers where members of the Women's Army Corps would have processed the data, sent it off to Ottawa, and then the CBC would have broadcast the information to the nation saying, this place is contaminated, don't go there. And here the two filter centers would have been at Brandon Armory and Pine Falls Armory. Now going to the FRPs, there were actually three different types that were built. The most common were the basement types, the type A's. So this would have been in an appropriate federal building like an RCMP detachment or a city hall or something like that. Remember, these were all in small towns. There was no point in putting them in the city because it would have been obliterated. So they would have added a little bit of extra concrete, and then they would have put in bunk beds and plotting tables and radiation monitoring equipment, shelves for stores and things like that. Where they didn't have an available basement, they would build Type Bs. And Type B was a cylinder that was buried in the ground, very much like the one in Victoria Beach. And finally, if in the place where the water table was too high to dig, or you couldn't get heavy earth-moving equipment to dig a hole, say way out in a provincial or national park or something like that, you built a Type C, which was just a concrete cube on the surface. Looks very much like a garden shed. Now, as I said, they tried to build these shelters mostly on federal land. So these are all the departments within the government that would have manned these. Some of them were on Army bases. The whole thing was administered by the Army. The RCMP detachments in small towns, Mines and Renewable Resources, which is conservation or the Forestry Service, Department of Indian Affairs, Customs, then the railroads and the post office. The idea here is that these are government departments. They're not going to say no. They're going to be very cooperative because they have to obey orders. Didn't actually turn out that way, actually. Especially the RCMP was often very resistant to building these fallout shelters. Number one, because they were already using their basement for something, but also because the RCMP in those days in small towns tended not to have their own dedicated buildings. They tended to rent out private residences, just houses to use as the detachment, and they had to deal with the owner, and the owners often didn't want these things buried in their backyards either. So the RCMP, by and large, told the government to go away. And they found it was actually much easier to deal with private or semi-private interests. Post office was more than happy to comply, and especially the railroads. The railroads were very patriotic and were, very enthusiastic about building these shelters. And also they had their own telegraph network, which came in handy for communications. So these posts would have been equipped to take, on average, 2 people and give them supplies to survive around 2 weeks. And they would have been equipped with this sort of gear. So the NUDETs were equipped with a bang meter, which is a vacuum tube. It's a photodiode that detects the double flash of a nuclear weapon, and from the timing of the double flash, the intensity is able to determine the yield. And then a ground zero indicator. The ground zero indicator is a British device, and you'll actually see it in action. And if you look up that video, A Hole in the Ground, it's basically a pinhole camera. So you have a cylindrical canister with a little pinhole that acts as a lens. You have these 4 pieces of graph paper, and where the graph paper gets burned by the flash being focused through the hole tells you the altitude and the direction of the blast. You can triangulate between several different posts to figure out where it was and how big it was. We had our own version, which had a fantastic name. They called it the Educated Stovepipe. And this is just a weird name. It was just a piece of pipe with a bunch of holes drilled in it and a piece of styrofoam. And then the direction that it was burned, and then the intensity, how deeply the styrofoam was burned, would tell you your direction and your yield. But we also had the British style ones as well. Now, the fallout reporting post was meant to be equipped with these, the IM5015TD. This is a remote monitoring radiac meter. It detects gamma rays, It has a separate monitoring head that you put on the surface. Wire comes down into the bunker, and you have a console, this thing right here, that you can use to monitor radiation from inside the bunker. The Army ran out of those really quick. They didn't have enough of those to go around, and so they started issuing the volunteers who stepped forward to actually man these things with handheld gamma meters, meaning that if you volunteered to man one of these bunkers, every hour, on the hour, you had to put on your protective gear, go outside, take a reading, come back down tracking fallout in as you did, and then use your very limited water supply to decontaminate yourself. And as if life wasn't hard enough, this is what you were given inside a standard FRP. I'm going to give you a moment to guess what's missing here. Anybody see something very important that's missing? Yeah. You got plenty of paper towel, 20 paper towel rolls, no toilet paper, not even single ply. So on top of everything else, when you come out in 2 weeks, your bottom is going to be very sore, I would expect. But I found that quite amusing when I discovered this list. I knew I had to put it up there. There's a lot of weird things you find in these archives. One of them, which I found particularly disturbing, going a bit off script here, was that in the city, there were 4 fallout reporting posts, which were fire stations, fire halls. But in the actual table that explains the nature of each fallout reporting post, it says, no modifications required. So you have 4 fire halls in the city that's going to be obliterated anyways, not given any special protection. They basically expected the firefighters to stay there and die. Rather disturbing detail. I don't know the whole story behind it, but from that information, it's kind of bleak. Now, NDFRS, as I mentioned before, was canceled in 1963 after they'd finished about 1,000 of the 2,000 fallout shelters that they were going to build. There's a number of reasons why it never worked or why it was never completed. Number one is money. The government just ran out of money. The second one is when this was started, they believed that any exchange, any altercation they had with the Soviets was going to escalate into full-scale nuclear war. So there was a culture of preparedness. But after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, people realized, well, no, we can use diplomacy to back away from these confrontations. And people weren't quite as pessimistic. And so these sorts of civil defense measures became less and less relevant. And also, Canadians at the time were rather apathetic and fatalistic. They're like, well, the bomb drops, we're all dead anyways, why didn't do anything about it? And the government had to try really, really hard with propaganda campaigns to get people to actually give a crap. So they decided that this was not worth the money. There were other more technical reasons. Number one was communications. So when this was implemented, NDFRS was supposed to be connected together using ordinary phone lines. Ordinary phone lines run through central exchanges. Central exchanges are in cities, the very cities that are going to be obliterated the moment the bombs drop. So the moment an attack started, the whole communications network would have gone dead and the whole system would have been useless. It would have just succeeded in protecting a couple of RCMP officers and forestry officers for 2 weeks. It wouldn't have done any good for anybody else who wasn't in one of those shelters. The other problem was that it had a problem finding volunteers in the first place because there was only room for 2 people. They had to be trained. You couldn't bring your family along. A lot of people said, no thanks, I'd rather be on the surface with my family. So what the government did was to incentivize people. They said, okay, well, if you volunteer, you can bring your family down into the shelter with you. Now consider that these are only designed for 2 people for 2 weeks, and you bring in a whole family, you already have problems. And then consider on top of that, that if you're one of the unlucky shelters that doesn't have a remote monitoring system and you have to go out every hour with your little gamma ray meter, you're tracking in all that fallout and you're wasting the water that your family is using. It would have been a suicide mission. So in total, this whole project really never would have worked the way that the government wanted it to. So it was probably a good decision that they canceled it. So this is where I come in. When I first found out about this project, and I read an article by, as I said, Andrew Birch from the Canadian War Museum that explained what NDFRS was, I decided to see whether the Library and Archives had any information. Well, they did. Quite a bit of it, actually. And again, thanks to our friend Gord Crossley, I contacted a gentleman whose entire freelance job is to go into the archives and photograph whatever you want. And he does it a lot faster than the actual government employees, so it's quite handy. So I went in the index, I found everything that said NDFRS, told him, go wild. And he brought me back thousands upon thousands of pages of very fascinating documentation, most of which has been classified since 1963 and has not seen the light of day until I requested it. When something is declassified, they don't suddenly go into the archives and actually go in and declassify every single thing that falls under it. They wait until somebody requests it, and then they'll look through and see if it's actually classified. They had to do that with pretty much every document that I requested, so this has not been looked at since 1963, which is a lot of fun. And doing just a preliminary search through it, I found exactly what I was looking for, which was these extensive lists of all the shelters that were built in every single province, and this is one for Manitoba. And it gave me all the information I needed. It said what type it was, A, B, or C, what town it was in, what department would have operated it, and also coordinates in Georef. So I thought, okay, this will be really, really easy to find. I just type in the coordinates, convert them into regular coordinates, and I can just go to that spot and find to see if the shelter is there. Not quite. Because, as it turns out, the coordinates that they give are not quite accurate at all. So if you're not familiar with the Georef system, it's sort of a fractal grid system. So you have, say, GJ here, and then you go to LD, and then it gets numerical as it gets smaller. So, for example, I decided to test it with the Victoria Beach shelter, which is the only one I knew about at the time. This is where it actually is. This is where the Georef position said it was, more than a kilometer away. So given that these things are very small, that's not a way to locate them. So I checked it with a bunch of other shelters that I knew that the Manitoba Historical Society had already located. There's about 5 other ones that they know about, and they were all similarly inaccurate between 100 meters and a couple of kilometers away. So I had to find another way of finding these things. There was really no substitute for hitting the streets. So this is all of the shelters according to the records. I plotted them on Google My Maps. I'll explain what the colors mean a little bit later, because this is the map as it currently is in terms of the ones I've actually confirmed. Okay, so what I did using that map was to find clusters of shelters that I could hit in a single day. And the first cluster that I decided to hit was Birds Hill, Winnipeg Beach, and Gimli. And Gimli was more of a consolation prize. I'd asked on an RCF forum where it would have been, because it was supposed to be at RCF Gimli, and they said, oh, it's still there. It's right under the old control tower. And so I went on Google Street View, and there it was. So I'm like, okay, if I don't find the other two, then I'll at least have something to look at. And that turned out to be a good policy, because I went to Birds Hill, and that was a railroad one. So I walked up and down the rail line for about 1 kilometer in either direction of Birds Hill and found absolutely nothing. Like, okay, I guess it was destroyed. Then I went to Winnipeg Beach. And there were a couple of problems here. Number one, Winnipeg Beach is very big. The streets are very narrow, lined with trees, really hard to see anything. And I didn't actually know what I was looking for, because in all of those documents I got from the library and archives and everywhere else, none of them said what a Type C shelter looked like, the above ground ones. There were no drawings, there were no photos, there was nothing. All I knew is that they were above ground. Didn't know if they were covered in a mound of earth, if they were cylindrical, if they were square. No idea. So I just wandered around Winnipeg Beach trying to find something I didn't know what it looked like. And I gave up after 2 hours because I found absolutely nothing. And then went up to Gimli. And just as the guys on the RCF forum had said, there it was, just a little mound with a concrete cube and some ventilator stacks sticking out. And this is a microfilm that I actually found in the records that I obtained from the archives, and you can see that it matches perfectly. This right here is that ventilator stack. Unfortunately, the entrance, which should be right here, was completely caved in, and from what I've heard, the whole thing is flooded. I asked the RM and the airport authority if I could do an excavation. They said no. And so I had to content myself with taking some pictures of the outside, which required a bit of mild trespassing, because this is actually on the air side. Don't tell anyone. So it became very clear that I would have to change my strategy if I was going to find these things. So the next expedition I decided to mount was to Woodridge, because the shelter there, according to the records, was a Type B shelter operated by Mines and Renewable Resources, the Forestry Service. And I knew that Woodridge had one of the last Firewatch towers still preserved in Manitoba. So that would be the obvious place to find it. It'll be beside the Firewatch tower. So I drive to Woodridge, find the Firewatch tower, which is on... It's a provincial park, but it's like just an acre of land with the tower on it. It's a really weird provincial park. So I search all around it and find absolutely nothing. So of course I'm getting very frustrated here. It seems that these things have completely disappeared. But I've driven all this way, so I decide, the heck with it, I'm just going to ask somebody. I had assumed that people wouldn't know what I was talking about, that this was so obscure that it would have been forgotten about, but I find a person right across the street, first person I lay eyes on, chopping wood, walk up and ask, do you know anything about fallout shelters from the Cold War? He says, no, but my wife does. So sure enough, 5 minutes later, she drives up and she says, you're looking for fallout shelters? And I said, yeah. She's like, follow me. And then I paused for a second. It was like, fallout shelters, plural? Sure enough, there's 2 of them. At the time, I had no idea why that should be. Why would there be 2? Each town was only supposed to have 1. But it turns out this was just an ordinary-looking house, but this was actually the forestry station. So there was the tower, which is around 1 kilometer away, and the actual forestry station, and then the shelter is in here with the 2 ventilator stacks. And at the time, I thought that, oh no, he's buried over the hatch. I'm going to have to deal with the owner to be able to excavate the hatch and go down and see what's left inside. Turns out that's not the case, but we'll get to that. And then the other one was just on the side of somebody's trailer. And apparently, this was the one from Whitemouth Lake, which was the next site I was going to go to. The guy bought it in the 90s, trucked it over to Woodridge, buried it in his yard to use as a forest fire shelter. And it's actually an interesting part of the whole story is a lot of these shelters have found very interesting second lives, and we'll see a couple more examples later. Although one thing I don't understand about this is that would be a horrible place to hide in a forest fire because last time I checked, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide flow downhill. So you would just go in there and just die of asphyxiation. So I don't know what the logic was. And the lady also put me in touch with an old gentleman who was a forestry officer in the 60s, and he was trained to operate one of these shelters. He was able to tell me a lot of very interesting facts. And he was the one who told me, don't go to Whitemouth Lake, it's already there. So it saved me a trip. And then I decided, because I'd already found 2, might as well take my consolation prize and make it 3 for 3. So I went to Moose Lake, and this is right beside the highway. You can actually see it from the highway when you drive by the entrance to the Moose Lake campground and summer camp. And so this is a very typical Type B shelter, just like the one in Victoria Beach. You've got a hatch, you've got the 2 ventilators, you open up the hatch, you've got a ladder that goes down a vertical shaft, and you end up in this little room. And this is very small. This is only 3 meters in diameter and 3 meters long. Imagine staying down there for 2 weeks with another guy. You'd probably emerge and the other guy wouldn't. And about the only equipment that's left in any of these, because again, they were never given any of their equipment, they were never furnished, is a pair of bunk beds, some shelving for supplies, and a hand-powered air pump. And another thing I want you to keep secret, the handle for that had broken off. I decided, well, if somebody's going to steal it, might as well be me. So it's now in a display case in my house. All right, so at this point, I'm like, okay, I've come up with a new way of finding them, which, surprise, surprise, was just ask. So I wanted to see if that would work again, so I could find my elusive Type C shelter. So I knew there was one in Saint-Pierre-Joli. I figured Saint-Pierre-Joli is smaller, the streets are wider, and there's fewer trees. It should be easy to find this thing. So I roll into town. This thing I know is run by would have been run by the RCMP, so I go to the RCMP detachment. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So I decide to go to the museum. Museum is conveniently closed that day. But there's somebody watering the flowers outside. So I asked them, do you know anything about a fallout shelter in town? She's like, yeah, it's right there. Just across the street in somebody's backyard. And there it is. You can't really see. It looks like a garden shed. I could have walked past it 100 times and never known what it was. The giveaway is our old friend, the ventilator stack. But this thing is not a corrugated metal garden shed. This thing is made out of meter-thick concrete with steel plating on the outside. It's very deceptive. And the guy was using it as a garden shed. It was just full of tools. So knowing what one of these looked like, I decided to try and find the one in Winnipeg Beach. I took a photo of this. I sent it an email to the RM and asked, does anybody know if one of these is in town? And the same day, I get a reply from their financial officer saying, oh yeah, I'm looking out my window right now. So I go up to Winnipeg Beach, and there it is, right in the backyard of the municipal office. And they're using it for document storage. Again, these things live very interesting second lives because, well, you can't move that. Like I said, if you look in here, that's a meter of concrete covered in corrugated steel. You're not moving that, not for cheap anyway. So they make use of them as the way they can. And so I was able to take some measurements and create my own set of drawings, which, so far as I know, I don't know exist anywhere else. So some interesting information I was able to dig up through field work. So this is getting very encouraging. And so throughout the rest of the summer, I followed the same pattern, and I was often very successful. Although sometimes I would go into town and ask the first person I saw, and they would know exactly what I was talking about. Sometimes I had to do a bit more of investigative journalism, and it often got very entertaining. For example, in Stead, anybody here been to Stead? Yeah, it's not even a town, it's a hamlet. It's in between Victoria Beach and Pine Falls. So I roll into town, go up and down, can't see anything, decide, oh, well, the post office is there. I'm sure the person who runs the post office knows all the town's secrets. But this being rural Manitoba, the post office is closed for lunch for 2 hours. And I happened to arrive right at noon. Like, okay, go to somebody's house next door, ask, do you know anything about this? Show him some pictures. And he says, no, but the person who runs the post office is at the community center. Go there. Go to the community center and walk into a knitting circle. A bunch of old ladies around a table, knitting and gossiping. And I'm like, oh, pay dirt, this is going to be good. Show them the picture. They're like, oh yeah, the family who owns that are just down the road, turn left at the hedges and you're right there. Roll up. Of course, the guy says, yeah, absolutely. I used to own that land, sold it to a guy a while ago, but just go back up the road about 1 kilometer, turn onto this driveway, and you'll see it. And sure enough, there's nothing else there. There's just a piece of agricultural equipment there and a mound with the ventilator stacks and the hatch. Unfortunately, and this turned out to be something of a pattern, completely flooded. Even though they had the option of building a Type C shelter in places where the water table was too high, there's quite a few places with a high water table where they built a Type B and they're just completely flooded and rusted almost to nothing. So that was disappointing, but it showed that my search methods were working. Another really neat discovery was in McCreary. So you remember in Woodridge, I said I thought that the hatch was covered over. Well, it turns out that's not the case. There's actually another type of Type B shelter that wasn't in any of my records, which is one that's accessed through the house itself. So if you go into the basement of this house, the owner was kind enough to take these pictures for me. You've got a door in the basement, go through a little tunnel, and you've got this nice little cylindrical room. And then the only evidence of it on the surface is this mound, and then you can see the ventilator stack he has artfully turned into a bird feeder. So again, something that the records didn't show, something that I learned that I didn't know before. So a lot of interesting information coming out of this project. And again, speaking of second lives, so when I went to Grahamdale, I did a big trip up to the paw and back to find a bunch of them out there. When I was in Grahamdale, I managed to find an old gentleman who knew exactly where it used to be. So the post office used to be there and it was there. Oh, and when they closed it down, my brother took the shelter and installed it on his farm. And he showed me the location of the farm. So I went there, and there it is. And it's been converted into a welding shed. So the tunnel would have been here. He's removed it, and then this is just the entrance. And then you can see the structure on the inside is the same. The original shelving would have been here, and he's removed the bunks on the end. But it's very recognizable as a Type B shelter. You've probably noticed there's actually two distinct types of Type B shelters. There's the smooth, and there's the corrugated. I have no idea why there would be two. My best guess is that there were two different companies that were contracted using the same specifications, and one preferred to use corrugated steel and the other preferred to use smooth steel. Having one of these out of the ground actually solved another mystery, which was how's the floor built? Because the one in Victoria Beach, it looked like the curve of the walls didn't actually go all the way down. They had cut it off and welded a plate on the bottom. Like, why would you build it that way? That would be not as strong structurally as having a cylinder. That's exactly how they built them. They're just cut off at the bottom with a plate welded in place. They're not a perfect cylinder. Again, no idea why. Hopefully in the course of my research, I'll be able to solve that mystery. Now, a really fun one was in Pine Falls. So remember, that's one of the two filter centers where they would have processed the data from all the fallout reporting posts and sent it up to Ottawa. This is one of those cases where people were a lot more helpful than I thought, because I went to the municipal office because they run the old armory, which is defunct, it's closed off, nobody uses it anymore. went up and thinking I would be rejected out of hand, I said, could somebody let me into the armory? And the lady's like, yeah, sure, I'll grab my keys. Drive over, and she lets me in and lets me explore the very, very creepy basement. And in the basement is this long hall that they use as an archery range for quite a while. This building has been through several lives. It was a fire hall at one point. It was the armory. It was a rec center and dance hall. It was an arcade, things like that. But when I went up to the main level, I noticed that there was a slab about 8 inches thick of concrete poured on top of the entire length of this room. And there's no other apparent reason why that should be, so my best guess is that was extra radiation shielding over top of that hall. And if you look at some of the drawings of a standard filter center, it does have this long corridor that's meant for decontamination. So that's probably what that is. I'm going to try to corroborate that by going to the Brandon Armory next and seeing if their basement is similarly laid out. So that was a fun one. But most fun was when I went up to Hollow Water First Nation, which is about a 3-hour drive, and I drove in the pouring rain. It was nerve-wracking. And I went to the band office and asked, have you seen something like this? And they're like, oh yeah, that used to be where the school is now. They tore it up when they built the school in 1963. I'm like, oh, I've just driven 3 hours in the rain for nothing. And he's like, oh, no. It's out in the woods. They pulled it up and just threw it in the woods. It's still there. And they took me to it, and there it was. One of the corrugated type shelters, completely unburied. It's been sitting there since 1963, and it's in remarkably good condition. I didn't actually go inside. There was no way of getting in except climbing up here, and I am not Spider-Man. But there's a hole in the side, and as you can see, despite sitting in the rain and the snow for years, it's in pretty decent condition. So that was another fun find. But sometimes, and very often, I came up completely empty. And what I started to notice was that all the shelters that had been operated by the railroads were gone. I have not found a single railroad-operated shelter that is still there. And the story from the people in these towns is pretty much all the same, is that around 1973, all of them were torn up. And this kind of makes sense because in a lot of the places where they built these, they're kind of out of the way. You'd have to move earth-moving equipment and cranes and trucks and things like that. Very inconvenient to move them. But along the railroad track, you can pull up a railroad car with a crane and just pluck it out and take it off to the scrapyard. They had the logistics to do it. So it would make sense that at the same time, CP and CN would just order them all torn up at once. So this is in Letellier, and according to a gentleman who lives nearby who's lived there his entire life, the Type C shelter would have been right here beside the platform, which has also been torn up, because that used to be a passenger terminal, but is no longer. This is up in Prospect, which is just north of the Pas. There's the remains of the pads for a Firewatch tower, and then the foundation for a Type C shelter is right beside it, and I measured it, and it matches up. So that's all that's left. There's a surprising number of these that are just vanishing. So this is why I'm finding it very important to record and find out about this, because after a while, people are going to get tired of having these things lying around, and they're going to destroy them all. So, bit of a summary. These are the ones at the top that were already known about through the Manitoba Historical Society, and specifically Gordon Goldsborough, the gentleman who writes the Abandoned Manitoba books. He's actually done a little bit of work recently. He's made a video on these shelters, and so we've been corresponding and exchanging some of our data. But all of the other ones right here are all the ones that are intact that I've found so far. So I've pretty much tripled the number that are known in Manitoba, as well as a large number that I've confirmed were either never built or destroyed at some point. So quite good for a summer's work. However, there's still a lot more work to do. You'll notice I didn't go after Type A shelters. This is because, by and large, there's really nothing left. These were just basements. Sometimes they would have added a little bit more concrete as radiation shielding, but by and large, they just put in bunk beds and tables and things like that, stuff that could easily be removed. There'd really be no way of knowing that they were a shelter in the first place. So that's something I'll investigate later, but I thought it would be much easier and a much better way of getting in my search system, looking for the very obvious bunkers, the Type Bs and the Type Cs. And then there's about 18 remaining Type Bs and Cs, but those are all up near Flin Flon, so that's going to take quite a few other expeditions next summer. And then once Manitoba is done, I plan to do all the rest of the provinces one one a year or one every 2 years or something like that until I found pretty much everything that there is in Canada and can write my book on it. It's going to be a long process, I admit that. I have to go to the Brandon Armory. I've got a couple of people I need to interview who were trained to operate these shelters or grew up around them. And then a bunch of other information to find. One thing I was not able to do is contact the RCMP archives. They never replied to my emails. It would be very useful to find out where all of these smaller detachments were because they're houses. Once the RCMP moved out, they left no evidence that it was a detachment. So they're really hard to find unless you can find somebody in the town who knows where it was, and sometimes they don't. So it would be some very interesting information to know. And then finally, there's an exciting part of the project, which has been frustrating to put together. When I went to the town of Miami, where there was a Type B shelter, but it was torn up in the 70s. Actually, I have a funny story about that. When they tore it up, they tried to be secret about it. They did it at night, but then they hit a power cable and knocked out power to the entire town. So everybody came and watched them. So much for that. But when I went there and I spoke to the curator of the little railway museum there, which is worth a visit. It's a nice little railway museum. It's the old railway station that was built in, I think, 1909, quite a while ago. And they said, oh, yeah, we know exactly where it used to be. It's no longer here, but they were going to put an interpretive plaque where it used to be saying what it was. And then it occurred to me, the one instead, the owner doesn't want it. It's on his land. He wants to develop the land. It's really big and heavy to move. Maybe the museum might be interested in acquiring this thing and moving it to the museum. Thought it was kind of a cockamamie idea. Thought I'd ask anyways. It turns out, not only is the museum really gung-ho about it, the entire town, including the town council and everybody who has earth move equipment or landscaping businesses, really into it. They want one of these shelters to display. Unfortunately, the gentleman who owns the Stead shelter turned out to be a bit of a greedy guts. When I tried to negotiate with him, he said, well, how much are you going to pay me for it? I said, well, it's not worth anything except scrap metal value, other than historical value. And the cost of digging it out and moving it is going to be about as much as the money you're going to get for the scrap metal value. So I said, just let the museum take it and they'll be doing you a favor. But then he just stopped responding. I then tried to get into contact with the gentleman who owned the one in Hollowwater First Nation. Got in contact with him once. He said he would call me back. He never did, and he's impossible to contact. And now I'm going through the Manitoba government because they've got a whole bunch that they want to dig up to stop people from going into them and getting hurt. And we'll see where that goes. But if you manage to get one, the idea, and yeah, this is cut off, you really can't see. This is the actual railway station, and the shelter would have been in and around here. Because if you buried in the ground, it's only accessible through one of these very narrow hatches, and even an able-bodied person would be able to hurt themselves going in. The idea instead is to build a mound over it and have it actually at ground level. And there would be like a culvert through the side of the hill right here. And then you would cut off one end and put a sheet of plexiglass so that people could actually walk up and look inside. And the plan would be to furnish it as if it had been operational. And I know people who have the radiation monitoring equipment. I know people who know where to get all the original equipment from the 60s, the ration boxes and things like that. And that would be the plan, is to dress one up as it would have been operational, have a sheet of plexiglass, and let people look inside and see what it would have been like. And the town is very enthusiastic about this, and hopefully within the next few months I'll be able to track down a shelter that they can go get. And it'll be the only NDFRS shelter, the only piece of infrastructure on public display anywhere in Canada. So if that goes through, it'll be really exciting. And that's it. Thank you so much.